Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. I was chatting with a gentleman that I had interviewed previously last week over lunch, and he had expressed some concerns about democracy in Canada based on his experience of being a candidate in the last provincial election. I want to introduce you again to Shelley Brown, who was a Liberal candidate in New York Centre in the last provincial election. He did not win. He had a good fight. He did. It was interesting. You got as many votes, Shelley, as the leader of the Liberal Party, Stephen Del Duca, got in his riding. So I guess you did reasonably well. But that's not the topic of the conversation today. I guess the topic of the conversation today is that you ran into some partisanship and some vitriol on the campaign at the doors and the campaign streets. And I guess what your point was at lunch the other week is that you're really worried about democracy in Canada. Tell me a little bit about why you raised the concern, sir.
Well, I think that it boils down to one basic concept, although there are many aspects of this, and that is that there is no common ground. There is an absolute position on those people who feel that their freedoms, quote unquote, their liberty, quote unquote, is at risk or is not being guaranteed and respected. And this is associated with that whatever measures are being taken by the governments that exist, and typically it's really at the federal level, but it seems to sort of boil down to the provincial level as well, are tyrannical. And you have these absolute terms that are
tyrannical.
Exactly.
That's a strong word.
It's interesting, during the course of my campaign, and I think this was before I became the candidate, while I was still vying for the nomination, there was a Willowdale event that Chrystia Freeland was supposed to be at, and she actually did show up, but the event was postponed or at least suspended for a period of time because somebody showed up who was wearing a T-shirt that said Tyranny Response Team. And he had some cables with him, and so they basically wanted to ensure that there was no safety risk. And ultimately, the event continued, and she had a chance to speak and whatever. I actually had a picture taken with her, but that was in the parking lot while we were waiting for things to open up again. And that really resonated with me, because when you use a term like tyranny, in the context of Canada and the types of institutions we have and the type of democracy that we have and the type of protections and those types of things, it brings the debate, and I use that term very loosely, into a situation where there is really no dialogue anymore. And that's really of concern to me. I think we need to take a step back and look at where we are at this moment, see who the players are, and really try and work through where we stand in order to protect our democratic institutions and our democracy. I think that's critical.
And how do we do that? What do we need to do?
Well, I would suggest is the $64 million question. I do think that that the first step along the way is to acknowledge that there is a risk, and that democracy potentially, if these issues are not dealt with and considered, is in peril. And I think once we recognize that, then those voices on any side of the spectrum who do not want that outcome to occur are more likely to sit down and talk about what we need to do and what the situation currently is that puts us at risk, in order to at least try to find some common ground. And if it's impossible to find common ground in a universal way, to identify those groups which are not capable of listening to all sides of the discussion, so that we can then at least be able to respond to the issues that occur as a result of their absolute nihilistic and I would suggest potentially dystopian positions. because we have to. It's not a question of marginalizing. It's a question of being able to identify who are the players that are ready to discuss the issues, regardless of their positioning on the political spectrum, and who is not, and those who cannot and will not listen. I think there has to be. I don't believe an accommodation is available, but I think we have to be aware of what their position is and who they are, and strengthen those voices that are willing to discuss the issues. Again, I say, and I think this is important, regardless of their positioning on the political spectrum, whether left or right. I think that's the way to at least start the process of dealing with this issue.
We're chatting tonight with Shelley Brown. He is a former candidate in the last provincial election, about the state of democracy in Canada, and given his experience at the doors campaigning in the election, he has formed an opinion that we've got some real problems. And we're going to take a break. Shelley is a lawyer, a former human rights activist, and someone who's thought deeply about this topic. Stay with us. We're going to be back in just 2 minutes. Welcome back, everybody, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. We're chatting tonight with Shelley Brown. He is a lawyer. He's a former human rights activist, and he's a former candidate in the last provincial election. And so he's got a firsthand view of what's going on in our democracy, and he doesn't like what he sees, and he doesn't like what he experienced. Shelley, you used some pretty strong words, nihilistic and dystopian. What do you mean by the use of words like nihilistic and dystopian? If you could explain, please.
Well, I think that in a democracy, it's a requirement, it's a necessity for the democracy to exist and to be successful, that there be respect for the institutions which support that democracy. And when you use terms like tyrannical to describe the democratic institutions that we currently have, and I would suggest, that Canada is exemplary in that regard. I think that Canada obviously is not perfect. We're always going to be at a point where we have to continually try to do better. There's no question about that. But we certainly have a democracy that's viable, that listens to all sides, and whose institutions help to balance excesses and try to avoid that. I mean, that's one of the reasons why we have a Charter of Rights, why there's a constitution. As Alexis de Tocqueville said, it's to stop the tyranny of the majority. And so that all of those elements need to be respected. They need to be part of the process. When you talk about tyranny in a situation where you're talking about mask mandates, or requirements to be vaccinated in order to do certain types of jobs where people are put at risk so that it protects those people, I think that you have a situation where those institutions are being denigrated, that the future is going to, if that's allowed to continue, and I think we have some elements of that in the United States, you risk the likelihood or the potential anyway that democracy is going to start falling apart, that our protections, all those things that we hold so dear, those freedoms that are real true freedoms in terms of the right to discuss things, to be able to get together and voice complaints and those types of things. Also a free press, so that there are there's a microscope that's put on top of politicians so that they know that they have to be careful and respect the electorate and those institutions, are things that we need to maintain. Otherwise, that democracy is going to fall apart, and it's going to affect everybody. Okay,
I hear you. And one of the other strong words that people used during the trucker convoy / occupation was communist, that we are a communist country. And I think a lot of people reacted negatively to that, and then wanted to compare that to Russia and Putin's invasion of the Ukraine, and saying that's what true prohibition of freedoms are, and communism is. But you use strong words too, and you criticized their use of the word tyrannical or tyranny, and you use nihilism and dystopian. So explain to me, if you could, why you think nihilism and dystopian are appropriate descriptions for what you encountered.
Well, I'm not suggesting that what I encountered was nihilistic and dystopian in nature. What I'm worried about is that it's heading in that direction, that these are negative forces that ultimately could, diminish our democracy to the point where the democracy itself is a toothless tiger, if you will. That it does not have the benefit of a true democracy, in the sense that all voices are heard, that everybody has a chance to vote for free and open elections, where true discourse that represents values that
is
people
that
have.
Nihilistic?
I think that if it gets too far, if we don't deal with these particular issues, these particular responses from these segments of society, that that an appropriate term would be nihilistic ultimately.
Okay, so how do you respond? Let me counterpoint to you for a second, if I could, and then let's talk about how we actually potentially respond. So, one of the complaints that the trucker convoy people had is no one was listening to them, and Maxime Bernier and the PCP did win. I think it was 6 or 8% of the popular vote in the last federal election, and clearly they were, anti-mask, anti-vaccines, and they got 0 seats in Parliament, and so therefore the voice of that group of society, albeit a small minority, but still, that part of society was not heard in Parliament. And then, numerous people did polls and found that something like 15% of the Canadian population were supportive of the trucker convoy. The trucker convoys people will say that understated the degree of support they got by a dramatic amount. And the people that are against the trucker convoy will say it overstated it. But, the polls said 15%. But 15%, if the polls are right, is 4.5 million Canadians. So, it's not a majority, it's not a plurality, but it's still 4.5 million Canadians, and 4.5 million Canadians do deserve to be heard. And they didn't hear their voice in Parliament, and the government of Canada refused to meet with them. And so in a democracy, shouldn't those people, even if you disagree with their point of view, don't they deserve to be heard? And the fact that they weren't heard, don't you think that led to some of the, maybe overreaction or even potentially criminal behavior, like the occupation that ended up being deemed to be criminal?
Firstly, I question whether or not they're not heard, period. I mean, there's an expectation on, in terms of certain groups that, and a determination on their side that being heard means that their viewpoint is accepted and given effect to, regardless of its positioning. Because on the counter side to what you just said is that there's 85% of the people, give or take, who don't agree with their position. So and in my discussion earlier on, I never said that we won't listen to what they have to say. I think that is very important, that the dialogue and the attempt to make a dialogue, a true dialogue, to hear what they have to say, and to not so much necessarily give effect to it in all areas and in every way, but at least to hear what the expectations are, what the positioning is, etc. But it has to go both ways. And if it doesn't go both ways, if there's not a willingness to acknowledge that, your 15% gives you the right, and justifies a certain response on the other side's part, those people, the 85% whose rights are counter to yours, or beliefs are counter to yours, that does not denigrate or deny your entitlement to your position. But what needs to happen is that there has to be a dialogue. That's the ultimate situation here. And dialogue requires that there is an openness to listen and understand and hear what the other side is saying.
Okay, but what they would argue is there was no openness to listen, that Trudeau Friedland, Blair, everybody refused to even meet with them in Ottawa. It also harkens back to, I think the biggest mistake Hillary Clinton made when she was running for president of the United States, where she called a certain segment of society deplorable and wouldn't meet with them. And when you do that, you inflame the tension to an unbelievable degree, do you not?
Well, again, there's always nuance to these issues, right? So, what we're doing here is we're engaging in a conversation relating to these particular issues within, a very, very limited scope of time. And therefore, it's very difficult to deal with these larger, the contextual aspects of them and really deal with them. So, in the larger context, yes, I agree. All of these things have an impact, and truthfully, she called them a basket of deplorables, and that it sort of brings
deplorable.
Well, that's true, but it also, one of the biggest concerns or responses to that particular statement was that it took everybody who supported Trump and put them into that basket. And so, she said basically, Trump and his basket of deplorables. So she did not delineate in any way, shape, or form, and that's where the nuance comes in. Yes, I think that was an overstatement. I think it was unfair. But at the end of the day, the other side, right, also has an obligation in any kind of discourse to be able to sit down and talk and understand both sides, their side, and get it across.
Okay, I'm not disagreeing with you, and I'll give you my own example. I was at an all candidates meeting during the provincial election, and supporters of the New Ontario Party and the Blue Party that were anti-mask, anti-vax people were, if not 50% of the crowd, were the plural, were one of the most sizable groups in the audience, and were by far the loudest. And every single time myself or other people tried to make a point that they disagreed with, they shouted us down, they harassed us, they heckled us, etc. And when people tried to confront them with authoritarian views on science, on medicine, etc., they, number one, heckled it. Number two, didn't believe it. Number three, came up with their own authoritarians on the opposite side that, was this, even though supposedly 95 or 97% of all physicians thought one way, they found their couple of quotes that were in that small minority to counter it. So I agree with you, what you're saying, that there was not a lot of willingness on that side to listen. But I come back to, didn't Trudeau did something, maybe not as bad as Hillary Clinton, but didn't he, by calling, and not just him directly, but the media, by focusing on the Nazi flag and the white supremacy arguments and the violence and the desecration of the war memorial, didn't we describe those people that were occupying Ottawa in such an extreme manner that we didn't listen to them, that we called them deplorable, that we effectively put them into a position where it was very difficult to have any kind of dialogue?
Okay, I agree with you too, to a large degree. However, let's put this in context, which again is a difficult thing to do when you have a limited amount of time. But the context within which Trudeau, okay, and let's not say Trudeau, let's not point to Trudeau per se, but the powers that be, though the governmental powers that be that needed to deal with this particular issue, right? We're dealing with an issue where the truckers came in and they took over a huge or very significant part of the city, and were acting, in my view, illegally. All right. And so the question then is, under those circumstances, what options are available to the powers that be, the government as such, right? At whatever level. And that is the context in which Trudeau was functioning. The context that was forced upon him by a situation where the truckers, right, who I agree are not they're not unidimensional. And by the way, it was only about 10% of truckers really who were part of this particular convoy.
This wasn't a trucker protesting convoy.
Okay,
the vast majority of truckers were vaccinated and were doing their job. This was
so what is Trudeau to do? What is the government to do?
Why wouldn't he sit down and talk to them? we heard the line, you don't negotiate with terrorists. These people weren't terrorists. At least in the beginning, they certainly weren't. And I've been to lots of protests and I've seen in the media lots of protests where people may be doing illegal things, whether they're blocking a railway or blocking a highway or doing other things. They get met with, they get listened to. People sit down and talk. Yes. They don't necessarily agree, but they listen. And we didn't sit down and listen. Our government tried to paint them as maybe not terrorists, but close to that, and as occupiers, and wouldn't even meet them, wouldn't give them the time of day. Okay, wasn't that the mistake?
Brian, I don't want to, it's hard to discuss this particular situation in the context that you're suggesting, because at the end of the day, the convoy, the demonstration, the protest, however you want to frame it, however you want to call it, right, was taking over a city. There are, anybody can go back, and hindsight is always 20/20, and say, well, you could have done X, Y, or Z. But in fact, you're basically being dealt a deck of cards with respect to what was actually happening, and there was an obligation to deal with that particular issue. And all the other elements surrounding that, whether or not they spoke to the people who were the leaders of the convoy at that moment in time or whatever, or whether they decided and felt that it was necessary to deal with the issue at hand and eliminate that as a problem, is something that, are two mutually exclusive things. As far as I'm concerned, yes. I've always said during the course of this discussion, and generally speaking, that there has to be a dialogue. And you have to acknowledge that the other side, whatever that positioning may be on the political spectrum, and whether it's potentially nihilistic or not, and I think in many respects, the fact that it is potentially nihilistic actually makes it more essential that you sit down and talk to that group of people, because you want to avoid that outcome. And so the answer, in my view, is yes, there should be a dialogue at some point in time. But when you put it in the context of an ongoing demonstration, which is taking over the city, where they're blaring horns 24/7, you don't really have the luxury of saying, you know what, let's talk about the nice little fine tuning out aspects of this thing. Maybe we'll deal with that later. Let's deal with the particular issue at hand. And again, I wasn't there. I wasn't with Mr. Trudeau at the time that these discussions were taking place, etc. I didn't know what knowledge they had in the background in terms of what was the plan of the truckers or the people who organized it. But ultimately, it was dealt with, right, in a way which was there was no bloodshed, and thankfully it dissipated after a certain period of time.
But it didn't solve anything. They're coming back on Canada
Allow me
Day.
one more thing, Brian. The people who are the most radical within that group of people, right? They have parties that they can go to who represent their position. And so within a democracy, that still exists. So if in that context of that particular demonstration, Trudeau or whomever did not speak to them, does not mean that they have no voice.
But again, I challenge you. The Blue Party and the New Ontario Party did win, I don't know, 4, 5, 6% of the popular vote in Ontario. Clearly a small minority, but they won that percentage and got no seats. The Green Party got 1 seat. And so there is something wrong with our political system, such that, that percentage of people in our first past the post system got 0 representation. And so they're not being heard in the legislature of Ontario. Anyway, we got to take a break. We're going to come back with Shelley Brown in 2 minutes. And I'm going to ask him how we solve this problem and what his recommendations are. Stay with us, everybody. Fascinating conversation. Welcome back, everybody, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour and a spirited conversation dialogue that Shelley Brown and I are having. Shelley Brown is a lawyer, former human rights activist, and a former candidate in the last provincial election, and someone that I think is going to have a real voice in the future of Canadian or Ontario politics. Don't know exactly how and where and why, but he is. Shelley, so, the challenge that we've got is that I think there's a portion of society that may not want to have a dialogue and may not want to hear because they're listening to a media, they're listening to an echo chamber, they're listening to some leaders that believe a different way, and they've got, even though we think there's authoritarian views, not authoritarian, authoritative views from medical science, from public health, from whatever that believe in the vaccines, that believe in COVID-19, believe in the benefit of masking, believe in physical distancing, that there's a different group of society that just don't. Anti-maskers, anti-vaxxers. And you've undoubtedly seen some of their social media posts and read some of the things. They've got some physicians, some public health experts that agree with them. Who knows whether they're qualified or not, and I'm not going to pass judgment on it, but they do. They may be a small minority, but they've got some people that they quote, that they publish on social media, that they're stuck in this chamber. And it's interesting, and you've probably seen the polls that a fairly sizable number of people that think that that Trump won the last election in the United States are also believers that vaccines don't work and or are bad for you. And also, frankly, for some strange reason, believe that Russia was justified in its invasion of Ukraine. So they really are listening to very similar voices that appear to have a certain track of non-mainstream beliefs on a whole bunch of different topics, and that they're getting their information from social media. So what you're saying is that we need a dialogue. Given that, and let me actually add one more to it, that frankly, a sizable number of that group may be joining the Conservative Party today and may end up being the reason why a certain front runner in that leadership race actually may win and take over one of the major parties. What do you do?
Well, that, as I said at the very beginning, is the ultimate question. What do you do? I think that you have to take this first step. And I think that the first step is to acknowledge, and this, in a sense, answered that question as to whether or not, Mr. Trudeau sort of did a misstep in terms of not actually meeting with these people. But again, I think in the context, I'm not sure, but I believe that he probably had no other alternative but to take direct action. But at the end of the day, the starting point is to invite everybody who is a stakeholder in these, with respect, and I would suggest everybody really does. I don't think there's any group that isn't part of that or should not be part of that dialogue, and hear them out. But I think it also has to be said at the very same time that we're ready to listen to what you have to say, but for there to be any progress or any acknowledgement of any side of this discussion, the other side has to also be willing to acknowledge a legitimacy for them to at least speak, and that if we're going to try and bridge the gaps that exist, then there has to be some willingness to negotiate and mediate and find some form of common ground, and then possibly agree that for certain things we're not going to find common ground, which inevitably happens in a democracy. But democracy is not necessarily a situation where everybody is happy. We're talking about the majority. We're talking to from a utilitarian standpoint, the greatest good for the greatest number, but it doesn't mean that everybody benefits equally. I think that's a virtual impossibility. It's not an impossibility in absolute terms. So at the end of the day, that's the starting point. And going beyond that starting point, I think will be much easier if people are willing to acknowledge the rules upon which that starting point must begin. And so that's really the answer. The answer is, firstly, acknowledge we have a problem. I think acknowledge that if we don't deal with this problem, there is going to be potentially a dystopian outcome. And thirdly, have a willingness on all parties to sit down and discuss it in a way which allows for a true dialogue, a true discussion, a back and forth with respect to the particular issues that we consider to be, indicative of our particular positions on these particular issues, and then we'll go from there. But until we get to that point, everything else at the end of the day is superfluous, and ultimately then power is what's going to make the ultimate determination, because the democratic institutions are not going to be able to function so as to resolve that issue. That's what I think needs to be done at this point.
Okay, but Shelley, in our hyper-partisan world that appears to be becoming only more hyper-partisan, and where some people would think the Liberal Party federally, maybe even provincially, has gone more to the left than it ever has been in the past, and the Conservative Party, particularly federally, has gone to the right, and maybe captive of some of the voices that you've just been currently describing, where you've got caucus members that are forming specific groups that are, talking about passing anti-abortion laws in Canada, that are opposing, that are, they're fighting in leadership debates about who was more supportive of the trucker protests, not in any way, shape, or form saying that they were inappropriate like you are. In that kind of environment, then the environment where people are, watching different media and following different people on social media. And so I don't think actually interested in dialogue. How do you force that dialogue on them?
Well, you can't truthfully force it on anybody. But I mean, what's the alternative, Brian? Firstly, by the way, to suggest that somehow I felt that the truckers I think they had a right to protest. I don't think there's any question about that. But at a certain point in time, it went beyond that, and that's when when push came to shove, something had to be done. But with respect to the larger issue here, the one that we're focusing on, that brought us together today, the issue really is, what's the alternative? There is really no alternative but to try and bridge these gaps. Because if we don't, we know where we're heading. We've been discussing where we are now and what the forces are, and what what the groups are who are not happy with the status quo. And so there is no alternative but to make this attempt. And if it at least gives us an opportunity to say, well, look, they're claiming that we're not even listening to them. And the fact is, we are. The fact is, we came with an open hand. We came with a sincere wish, because we don't want everything to fall apart, to listen and to work through these things so that we all benefit ultimately. It at least takes that argument away from those people who are, who would be sympathetic to their side of the story, but for the fact that we somehow, Trudeau somehow did not sit down and talk to them. That argument no longer exists. And that's the way I feel. I mean, that's what I think I would like to do if I ever get back into the political arena again, is because I think it's so critical for my grandchildren and my children and your grandchildren and the generations to come, when there are so many serious issues that are, and I'm going to use an absolute term, existential in nature, that need to be dealt with. We cannot have this type of rancor. It's impossible to deal with it. Our democracy will fall apart on its own without these people having, any of these people who have these particular positionings. They won't have to do what they're doing. It's just going to fall apart, because we won't deal with climate change. We won't deal with healthcare. We won't be dealing with all of the issues that we need to deal with. All of this is going to be becoming more and more unraveled. And that's what's happening in the United States, by the way. It's not that people are attacking healthcare, not that they're attacking things like that. It's groups who have a vested interest with respect to certain things, who are making the dialogue and the discussion impossible. I don't want that. I don't want that to happen in Canada. I just don't. I don't want it to happen.
So I want to give you, two examples. Your friend Howard Brown and myself were in the 1970s actually invited to go to Ottawa to visit with then Prime Minister Pierre Elliott Trudeau. And it was interesting because at the time he was on the rocks, and a lot of people were objecting to what his government was doing. And it was a fascinating process that he went through, where he wanted people from across the country and young people from across the country to listen to him. And it went on all day long. I think we started at breakfast time, and it was like 2 or 3 o'clock in the afternoon before we took a break, and he then responded. And all of us from across the country that came had that opportunity to speak. And we really felt like we had an opportunity to criticize what the government was doing at the time. And then my favorite president, President Bartlett from the West Wing, had a similar strategy at one point in time when he said, we're going to go out there and we're just going to address it all day long with everyone until they're worn out. And so I think that's part of the problem. And I think that you're completely right that at the end of the trucker protest and occupation, when clearly things had gone too far, it would have been inappropriate to meet with the truckers. But I really wonder whether we started, not we, but the government actually started the problem by not meeting with them initially. And so I do think that your comment about dialogue is critically important, and you gotta dialogue with people as long as they want to dialogue, as long as they want to talk. You got to listen to them. You got to wear them out, as Trudeau did, as Pierre Trudeau did with Howard and I back in 1976, and it was one of the most masterful experiences I've ever encountered of a politician wanting to actually listen to people and then remembering what they say and responding. Or that great West Wing show where President Bartlett just does a press conference until every single reporter was exhausted with asking the question. So I think that is potentially one of the solutions. But I don't think that goes far enough. And I really wonder where, we had a slight discussion about proportional representation, whether we need to find a way in our institutions that people that have minority views actually have an opportunity to express those views. You're on mute. Shelley, you're on mute.
I know. I said to myself, how'd that happen? Because I didn't click on anything. In any event, I agree with you wholeheartedly. But there still has to be a starting point, number one. And secondly, nothing should be off the table at the outset, other than an acknowledgement that there has to be a discussion. That's the only precondition, that there has to be a give and take and an acceptance on all sides of at least the right, and an acknowledgement that there's a sincerity on all sides. But after that, the discussion predominates, and the willingness to discuss and the continuation of a sincere dialogue based upon a wish to come to some common ground. That has to be the predominant theme of any kind of gathering in this regard. If that can happen, at least we've made the effort. I mean, there's nothing that guarantees that anything that we do in life or in politics or in any other area of human discourse or involvement is ever going to solve all the problems that we're concerned about. But one thing I can guarantee you is if we don't enter into that conversation, if we don't enter into that dialogue, that we are doomed. I am telling you that. I'm saying that absolutely. I will not go back on that. We have to be able to talk to each other. We have to acknowledge that everybody's voice, whether ultimately it may lead to ruin, is important to at least acknowledge, because it may very well lead to ruin. But the alternative is there's never going to be a resolution. And that to me is unacceptable. I will not accept that. I can't accept that.
Shelley Brown, thank you very much for chatting with us tonight. Really appreciate it. Thank you for your views on what happened during the last provincial election and how you see this concern for Canadian democracy. Really appreciate it. Let's check back in the future and see if you think that we've dialogued enough and things can change. It'll be interesting to see what happens with the potential for a reoccurrence of protests this weekend in Ottawa. So really appreciate you raising these concerns with us.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
We're going to take a final break and come back with some of my own concluding comments on this topic in just a minute. Stay with us, everybody.